thank you everybody for checking in this afternoon. We're very privileged to have Danille Verstegen this afternoon joining us, and thanks for putting on your camera so that everyone can see you're a real person, and Carol's with her too, so at least we'll have the tech. Danille's going to speak to us this afternoon about design-based research in education. And she's here doing a series of engagements funded by the Dirisana grant, for which we're, of course, very grateful. And we're also really happy that she's come to share her expertise with us. And we'd like to take the opportunity to encourage anybody who's around and about to bring to invest the time in really concretizing this idea of a way of organizing your research. So Danille is going to introduce herself. She's got some interesting info and she'll give you her canned bio. So I'm not going to do that, but I am going to say we're really grateful to you for joining us and we're looking very forward to your presentation this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction. And I do have a couple of slides introducing myself. So this is me with a different picture. I work at Maastricht University, where I'm director of She Educates, and that includes our Masters of Health Professions Education there. My background is in education, so in learning psychology, cognitive science, and mostly instructional design. And that is also where my research is mostly located. And actually all my own research is and has been design-based research even before that term existed. So a few words of the School of Health Professions Education, where I'm from. We are located at Maastricht University, which is a fairly new medical school in the Netherlands, only since 1976, strongly rooted in problem-based learning, because that's what we have done from the very start, which makes it different, I think. And we have a fairly large research in education group, a group that does collaboration projects that you're probably also familiar with, and some educational programs that we take care of. So I'm going to actually skip that. Where am I? Is this the right presentation, Carol, is it?
That's one you sent me.
Okay, yes, sorry. Sorry for that. No, it isn't. Yeah. Yeah, can we switch presentations, Carol? Because I think this is the one for the workshop.
You can indeed. We're happy to do that now.
Yes, I'm going to do that now. Just a second. So Carol's going to help me, and I'm just going to talk a little bit about what I'm doing this afternoon. I'm going to give you a little bit of background on design-based research, and then I'll try to illustrate that with two examples of PhD students that I've supervised in the last few years. Yeah, I'll give you the key here. So one is a research project on cross-border healthcare, and one is a research project on education palliative care. I'm not sure that they can actually hear me now.
Yes, you're still on the
Okay.
Wi-Fi.
So we can still hear you.
Yeah, so I'll continue and explain to you that we have arrived to design-based research because we saw that the field of education is a very fuzzy field to do research in, because education is always a complex thing to handle. And now I have to go and do that, right? So I'm sorry, I'm have to switch off
Hold fast, everybody. There is hope. Carol is about to start sharing her screen, and we hope that they're the correct slides. That's what happens, I think, when you travel and you're giving a lot of presentations over. Unless you label them with the date and time or something, I think it's quite easy to confuse which crowd you're talking to when. They're trying hard to share the screen again. Just as an interest while we're waiting, guys, if you can show me by a show of hands, because I've got names up on the screen, in the reaction button, the thumbs up, how many people have ever heard of design-based research as an actual concept, not just falling into it? Okay, so that's 8 out of 30 people. So actually lots of us are here to learn things for the first time, I think. And of the people who've heard of it, how many of you are actually using it in your projects currently? Mm-hmm. Okay, brilliant. Lizelle, I don't know if you want to give us the title of the project where you use that design-based research. I don't want to take up too much of their time, but would be nice just to hear like a practical way.
I've used it for my PhD, which was the design and development of a postgraduate course for advanced practice nurses on scholarship.
Okay, and so you used the process to do the whole project or a part of the project?
No, so I used the phases to structure my PhD and use different data collection methods within each phase of the design and development research process. Yeah.
Oh, that sounds really interesting. Sure. And we had one other person who had a title of a topic that they were using this method for.
I think it was me. I'm also
using
it for my PhD, and I'm looking at designing something. So it's still in its infancy, but looking at designing something around teaching law to non-law students.
Okay. Wow, Matty, that sounds really interesting. So we've actually got a wide range in terms of saying that it's like a tool that you could actually apply to any research project. And what we're going to try and hear this afternoon is particularly why it's useful to use something like this rather than just take a whole host of methods and say, well, I use this for this and that for that, and work through it that way. I'm waiting for messages from Carol to see that we actually do have a connection, but they are struggling. Which just goes to show all those teacher moments that we tell you. Yes, yeah, Carol, it's fine. We can see that you're trying to connect. We're having this discussion of other people who have.
You have to.
Sorry, everybody. Christine,
Okay.
could you just make Danille the presenter? She has just joined the meeting.
I'll do so now.
I feel happy that the delay has given 4 extra people the chance to join the meeting before we really started. So that's a positive thing, right?
And she is a presenter.
I'm back here, and the only thing now that I have to do is share my screen, right? So share the screen. Where am I sharing? This is it here? I don't. So has that got me back, has it?
Yes, so I'll give you feedback that we can see your screen, but you're not on presenter mode just yet.
But I am now, right?
No,
I've
not
just-
yet.
Not
Maybe
yet.
it's a time-related thing.
Might be, because I see you're sharing another application window. Sharing a different. Where did you find that? Yeah. Yeah, I did that. Oh, what did you entire screen? Entire screen. Yeah. Minimize that. Go back to here, right?
Yes, now you succeeded.
Yes. Sorry for that.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm sorry for that delay, but I'll go on and start telling you a little bit about our experiences in design-based research. And I want to acknowledge that I'm using slides from several of my colleagues here. A little bit of theory and then 2 examples, right? So this is what I was just starting to say, that in our experience, education is very complex. There are so many variables and we often don't have them under control. And that makes research in a more classical experimental way sometimes very tricky. Also because contexts differ and the complex interactions are difficult to study. So when we got thinking about this, we looked at Cook et al. In 2008, who distinguished different ways to study educational innovations, changes in education. You can do descriptive studies to see what was done. There are justification studies trying to prove that it works. And there are clarification studies where our main goal is not to prove that something works, but to understand why it works or how it works or when it works, under what conditions it works. And that's where we use design-based research, which focuses on research in complex real settings of education, which are always messy. We're still trying to improve practice, but also to advance theory. It's important, we think, to involve multiple stakeholders, and design-based research really always uses a mixed method approach. And I'll give you some examples later of how that could be done. Continuing a little bit of theory, design-based research is always something that happens in cyclical phases, starting with analysis and exploration, where we try to see what happens currently in our education in a certain field. We also explore the literature to see what others have done, but also to see how maybe learning theories could help us design or improve, innovate education. Then we go into a phase of design and construction, where we try to design new education or redesign education to try to make it better. And in the evaluation and reflection phase, we evaluate what happened with 2 purposes, really: to be able to improve our educational interventions further, but also to reflect on educational theory and see where we could build on our knowledge base there. So this is a figure that shows that we always go through these phases in a cycle. And we start off from typically a research question like, how can an educational intervention with certain characteristics support our learners to learn something else or to achieve our specific objectives? And I think this is easier when I show you later on with examples. And that's what I was going to try to do now, unless you have any urgent questions now. I can't see the chat, Shira, so maybe you can help me to understand whether there's something I should be answering at this moment.
I'll tell you if there are hands up or anything in the chat. At the moment, it seems clear for everyone.
Okay, well, then maybe I'll try to show this by example. Feel free to interrupt me at any stage if I'm too fast or if you feel you want to know more. So, first example is a project that we did with Juliette Beuken. And to give you a little bit of context, Maastricht is in this picture in the south of the Netherlands. And maybe you can see that we're very close to Belgium on one side and Germany in another side. And close means really close. It's 10 kilometers to Belgium, 30 kilometers to Germany. We have quite a lot of cross-border care. So patients from the Netherlands who go to Belgium for care or to Germany, either because the waiting lists are shorter or the care is more specialized, and the other way around as well. We didn't know very much about how this happens, but also how we train our healthcare professionals to take care of patients together when they cross borders back and forth. So Juliette started out with this interest. How can professionals take care of patients across borders and collaborate, and how can we support them and train them for this? Two main research questions. In the analysis phase, what are the perspectives and needs of healthcare professionals and patients in cross-border healthcare? And then the second one, which is more in the design and evaluation phase, how can educational interventions designed with practical needs and theoretical insights in mind support cross-border healthcare? So this is where we started out, trying to understand from healthcare professionals, how does this happen now? What are their experiences? What do they struggle with? And are they actually trained for this at all? Well, the answer to that last question is no, they're not. There's no specific training for people involved in cross-border healthcare. And we understood that there were actually, even at such short distances, quite substantial differences in how healthcare is organized, how tasks are divided between healthcare professionals, even how handovers are handled. There are different protocols. So people told us it's difficult to know how our colleagues at the other side of the border work. And so they felt they needed more preparation or more training for this. We also talked to patients who gave us a different perspective and told us it was very unclear to me who was actually responsible for me or for my care. There were all kinds of unexpected things that nobody prepared me to. And this is a funny one, that in Belgium, you go to the hospital, you have to bring your own towels. And I didn't know. That's a simple one, but it could also be more serious in the sense of who organizes transport for seriously ill patients, or how can we transmit information about patients across borders. That's not easy. And we heard from patients that they were obliged to pick up their own files and bring them across the border themselves because there was no other way often. So this is where we started from. We concluded that cross-border healthcare is challenging for healthcare professionals and patients. But what we also saw is that there was a lot of differences between situations. So problems arise that are very typical for Dutch patients crossing the border to Germany or Belgian patients crossing the border to the Netherlands. And there are differences to these contexts. We also saw that some cross-border care was very common. For example, when there was specialized care only available in one hospital in the region, such as liver transplants, for example, or when there were important waiting list issues for hip replacements. What we heard is that the stakeholders said they needed to meet each other and learn together about how they work. So that was our next challenge. How can we actually design training to prepare healthcare professionals to deal with patients crossing borders? We looked at literature then. What can help us to design a good training? And we came out with these 3 important learning principles. We needed authentic learning because we had learned that the situations can be very different. So we needed authentic learning tasks, authentic cases for our training to make this work. We also needed to make this happen by getting people together. We heard from healthcare professionals that they hardly knew the people across the border. So we felt that we had to get people together and make them learn together. And we went back to reflective learning as a 3rd learning principle. We designed 2 trainings resulting from that. One, which was a workshop for residents, where we mixed different specialties in a half-day workshop with a preparatory assignment before and a reflection afterwards. And we asked them to reflect on their own experiences, but we also discussed cases that were based on what we heard from patients in one of our own studies. So to evaluate that, we did a short focus group session at the end of the workshop, and we had questionnaires as well, and we interviewed the people giving the workshop. So we heard from people that the training was useful, that the participants felt that they were a little bit more prepared to deal with patients crossing borders, but also that they had difficulty understanding what they could actually do. And we saw that this differed really between people who had experience with patients crossing borders and those who had not yet, either because they were too junior as a resident or because they were in professions that weren't as involved. For example, a radiology resident who said, well, this is not something that I personally deal with. We continued and designed a second training session that was focused at the professionals who are actually involved in cross-border care. So those people already working and working in those pockets where cross-border care happens a lot. And we evaluated that in an expert evaluation study because this was in the middle of COVID and we couldn't actually get them together. The borders were closed at that moment. But we asked them, if we were to set this up this way, do you think it would work? And how do you think it would work? And what would work well and what would not work well? We asked physicians, nurses, other admin staff involved, and we also asked educationalists who had more insight in the educational setup of the training. And we learned more about that. We learned how the connection to practice is essential for learning, We learned about psychological safety, and we also heard from people that we would have to adapt this training to specific groups of people coming together. So this is a series of studies where we tried to study in complex practice, where we learned over the years more and more about what that practice was. We also learned from trying out trainings what worked and what didn't work. And then we tried to connect it back to both practice and theory. So we learned that if we want people to learn together, we need to know what that together means in specific situations. For us, for example, it was an insight that we have teamwork at very different levels. And the people who were involved in cross-border care in different countries often didn't feel like they were a team at all. They just handled the patient at the moment that they got the patient transferred to them and then transferred them back. But before and after, they felt very little responsibility. And they also couldn't, because they didn't really know the people on the other side. So we need to know more about that before we can specifically design training. So we also saw that our design principles to design this training did work, and we could set up a training to prepare people for cross-border care, but that we need to adapt this, and that we need to involve stakeholders in these adaptations, because otherwise it would never work. So, any questions, Shira, at this moment? Because otherwise I'll go over to my second example.
No, everybody seems to be absolutely spellbound. Thank you.
Well, I don't know if that's a good sign or not. I've actually lost visual of you, so I can't see your faces. So our second example, a completely different project that we were involved with. This is a PhD of Jolien Peters. And the question here that we started with was palliative care education in undergraduate medical curricula. So that's, for us, the term undergraduate means bachelor and master. I should clarify this because I've just discovered that for you it doesn't. So this is the idea that we shouldn't wait to start talking about palliative care until people go into residency, but that they can actually learn about palliative care in their bachelor and masters as well. And many people felt that wasn't done enough. So this is where Jolien started. But then, in the analysis, our first questions were these: what are the learning needs of students? Because we knew that from some publications in other countries, but palliative care is something that is quite country specific in how it's arranged and how it's done. And we also didn't know how stakeholders define the competencies that these medical students should learn in their undergraduate education, right? So there's large documents about competency frameworks for specialists, but not for medical students. So she did, I'm going to go through this part a bit quicker. We did question students using a questionnaire and some interviews. And we did a Delphi study to find out what about palliative care should be covered in the undergraduate curriculum, involving different stakeholders. And that's what we end up with, a very strong sense from everyone, in the Netherlands at least, that they felt palliative care is part of normal care and every doctor should should be able to take a role in that. We also came up with a competency framework of competencies that people felt medical students should have achieved by the end of their internships. And we got an insight in what is already addressed in Dutch curricula and what is often not. And examples of what was missing was attention for shared decision making, and attention for 4 dimensions of care, which are an important part of the Dutch setup, the social, and especially the spiritual dimension of care. And we focused our second part, our design and evaluation part of the studies on that, on the last 2 aspects. So then we went to educational theory. I thought, well, if we want to address that, what is important? We again came up with authentic learning, the idea that you should learn about palliative care in the context where it's relevant. So you need authentic cases, authentic tasks also to practice. Reflective learning, peer feedback is an important point in undergraduate curricula, and integration in the curriculum, which is something that we talked about a lot. We saw that palliative care was often stuck away in either a separate course or only in a course, in an oncology course, for example. And both our students and our other stakeholders, physicians and other stakeholders, felt that students should learn about palliative care in different contexts. So what did we do? We couldn't do everything, of course, but we started with some studies. Jolien started with one study where she designed a training intervention for 4th year students to learn to communicate about 4 dimensions of care: somatic, psychological, social, and that spiritual dimension of care. She actually asked students to, these 4th year students, for a bit of background, are interns at that moment in their study, so they could easily, with their supervisor, ask a chronically ill patient to have a longer conversation. We stimulated them to visit patients at home in pairs, not on their own, and have a longer conversation about how they experience their illness and how they experience these 4 dimensions of care. The students had to write a reflection of this conversation they had, and then they had a group discussion, and they also gave peer feedback on each other's reflection assignments. So actually, that's my next slide that I had missed. So this is what they did. We had to evaluate that. We again used mixed methods. So we had questionnaires. We interviewed students in the focus group. We interviewed the teachers who were involved in facilitating the group discussions. We analyzed the written reports of the students with their reflections. So we did a thematic analysis on those. And Jolien also went and observed those group discussions to get an impression of what was discussed. Combining all these data sources gave us insight in how this training intervention worked and how it maybe could be improved. And so what we saw was that it was well received by all stakeholders. Beforehand, we were told students will not like this, they will not be interested. That wasn't true. The students were actually very excited to have more time to hear the full story of patients. These chronically ill patients were excited because they had a chance to tell their full stories, and the supervisors were also happy. From the focus group discussions with students and also from their written reports, we saw that they still found the spiritual dimension of care the most difficult to talk about. So we did conclude that if next time round we should have better preparation for students to talk about this as well. We heard from students and saw that reflection is okay, but maybe not too much. They felt they learned a lot more from the group discussions than from the written peer reflection, written peer feedback that they had to do. And what we also saw and heard from the teachers is that the students found it difficult, that they learned a lot about these 4 dimensions of care, but they didn't have a clear idea of what that could mean for treatment decisions. Now, part of that is probably because they're young students and they don't have a lot of clinical experience. But we also concluded that this was partly caused by who actually the facilitators were in these group discussions, because they were people from our medical ethics department. And though they are not clinicians, so they could also not help students to make that connection. So this is a way that at least we saw clearly how we could improve this training next time. And Jolien went on and did a second study, but because of time, I won't go into that. I did want to say a few words though about what we learned from Jolene's studies about the educational theory, right? So we did see that it was actually quite easy to integrate a small extra training into an internship that already existed. We saw that the design principles that we used also worked quite well. But we also saw some limitations, for example, about when reflection is too much, or when what kind of reflection could help most. So, to conclude here, I've tried to give a little bit of introduction in theory, but also 2 examples to show you that design-based research is one way to do clarification studies, to uncover how something works or why it works or how it could work better. Design-based research is aimed at improving practice and advancing theory, understanding more about what works and when it works. It is a cyclical process with 3 different phases, but as you've seen, the single studies often focus on one of those phases. So typically, if we have PhD students, they spend some of their studies on the analysis phase and some of their studies then to design something, evaluate and redesign it again. Why do we need this kind of research? Well, I feel we need this kind of research to get a better understanding of why and under which conditions educational interventions work. And we can look at particular ingredients. We can look at what does authentic learning mean in different situations, for example, or what kind of reflections work better than other kinds of reflections in certain conditions. We also need this kind of research to enhance the transfer of what we find to other contexts. We need the rich descriptions of what we tried in which context and why, to be able to understand whether it also could work in another context or not. And finally, we need this kind of research to mature our interventions and advance our theoretical understanding to keep theory and practice always linked. I've included a literature list for those people who are more interested. And this was actually what I was going to tell you. Shira, can you?
That's terrific, Danille. Thank you very, very much. I don't see questions in the chat. Would people like to engage Danille, ask her specific things in relation perhaps to your own research or in relation to how she presented the examples that she showed us? I'm sensing everybody's very overwhelmed at how very neat it looked. The thing about presenting research after you've completed the research is it's so easy to, well, it's not easy, but it looks so simple when you've made the decisions about what you think it means. And my sense is that it's probably a very messy process until you get there.
Yeah, I'd say that's true. So when I present this afterwards, it looks like we always had a clear vision of where to go and what to do. But of course it wasn't. And when we started this project about palliative care education, for example, the general expectation was that students would be very scared of this topic. And that therefore it would be best to postpone that until their internships or maybe even until their residency phase. For us, I think that was a reason to start with asking students what did they think. And we asked some students informally. We had an advisory board for the project with some students in it who very adamantly said, no, of course, no, we want to learn about this. So yeah, that gave us an inkling, and that's why we started with students there to also have the leverage then, right? To go and say,
so one thing leads to another,
Yeah.
I see we have two questions down on the side. I'm going to ask Anastasia first and then Richard.
Hi, Danille. Can you hear me?
I can, yeah.
Yeah, thanks. For a second, I was going to ask if Carol was over at Maastricht, but I think you're downstairs on the second floor. So yeah, but thank you so much for this. I found it very interesting, and I've learned a lot from the slides that you went through. I just have a few questions, and they're questions more or less to help me as I also process the research journey. The first question I wanted to find out, and in no particular order of priority, how long did it take Julienne to go through this? Because I see the 3 phases. Did you have to get ethics from all the countries? Like, did you have to get ethics approval from Belgium, Germany, and also from the Netherlands to do this research? And I also wanted to just find out from just the perspective of, how it started. Was there, what sparked this interest in, researching palliative care education for undergrads? The other questions, I guess, would be questions I may ask in person. Thank you.
Yeah, so in both situations, I think what sparked the interest for the topic was that there were practical problems, right? So in the case of cross-border care, there were signs that cross-border care had much potential, but that there were also many problems, and there were very mixed opinions. Some people were very much in favor of it and some people were not. So that led eventually to a grant for a research project where we could appoint a PhD to do research in this. And yes, she did have to go through ethics approval in all those 3 countries, and it was horrible, but we managed. But in terms of time investment, that probably also makes clear that if you want to do the full cyclical approach of design-based research, of doing studies to analyze and then to design education and evaluate and improve it and evaluate it again, that is usually more, if you want to do all of that, it's more of a PhD project than one study. And so the single studies are often part of that process. For palliative care education, I think it was similar in the sense that there were concerns about, well, there's a lot of politics and history involved here. The Netherlands were one of the first countries to have official legislation on euthanasia. But then after a couple of years, there were more and more concerns that maybe students were only taught the legal aspects of euthanasia and not the whole rest of palliative care. We have a local expertise center for palliative care, and they actually came to us and said, we want to apply for a grant because we think this should be addressed from day one in undergraduate curricula. So it was kind of people from the work floor who felt this was important to work on. Does that answer your questions?
It does. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Anastasia. Richard, do you want to ask your question?
Sure, thanks very much, and really appreciate, Danielle, the presentation. First of all, a comment, if I may, before a question, and that is that, I mean, a lot of people on this call have been involved in putting new courses and programs together, and some quite innovative work. And I'm guessing that we would have produced a lot more research had we adopted this approach early on. And it really is a vehicle by which to capacitate teachers as opposed to researchers per se, with being able to tick the boxes of what academia requires of us, and that's to publish and to be involved in research. And I'm slightly irritated, to be frank with you, that we hadn't done this, some time before. I mean, speaks to participatory action research as well. Is another vehicle by which the same doing and researching can happen at the same time. But be that as it may, we'll improve going forward for your good inputs. Thank you. My question is, what about the ethics of testing on students, in the sense that, I mean, I'm putting it perhaps rather in an extreme way, but if one is testing interventions, be they instructional tools or the like, on students, does one have to be careful of just the impact on students and that affecting their educational journey along the way, in a manner that is not using them as students as the testing for the testing of instructional tools and the like, or the interventions, in the sense that then the focus is on the tools and the process as opposed to the students, if you hear me.
Yes.
Did you have to be careful of that, or do we have to be careful of that? And if so, how do we mitigate for that?
I think we do have to be careful about that. So for me, that's one of the problems I could have with experimental research, where you give one half of the students the new training that you've just designed and the other half of the students not, where you really disadvantage one or the other group. I think the perspective of design-based research is that we should take time to analyze current practice and the literature to try to design what we really think is the best education given our insights from practice and theory, and that we then evaluate that with the explicit aim to make the education even better, and the educational theory at the side. But so we try to design the best that we can with the insights that we have, and the research that we do along the side is there to help us gain more insight to make it even better in future. Does that answer a little bit?
Yes, I see he's giving us thumbs up. That's very good.
Yeah.
So Danielle, if I may, one of the things that really interests me about this way of looking at research, and everyone else will pack up laughing because this is classic me, but I'm really interested in how working like this helps you to extend theory and shorten the supposed theory practice divide, because that's one of the things that when we teach our postgraduate diploma students, everybody goes, oh my gosh, what's this theory for? Parks it on the side and carries on with the course, and only discovers right at the end when they want to start talking about designing a master's project that they need to scrabble and find a theory. And for me, this makes it seem that the theory becomes, the student becomes much more conversant with the theory in the process of them doing the work. And I think that not only does it make it more practical, but I want to know how a process like this could actually extend theory, and if you as a group have published added theory on the basis of the work that's been done.
Yes, so I'll try to give you examples from the, I'll try to link to the examples. So one of the things, for example, that we found out from design-based research like this is that you can do authentic learning only very well if you keep on looking at what authentic is for each different context. So we were trying to design training for cross-border care, and we discovered that for example, the training setup could remain the same, but if we want to train German and Dutch healthcare professionals collaborating, we have to adapt the cases to them. It's in authentic learning very important that authentic is authentic to the people who are participating. And that means changing the content of your training, and sometimes also the setup, because one important principle that we had is that we wanted this to be collaborative learning or team learning. But then we discovered that what actually the team is, people can have a very different perspective on that. Is it your local team or is it the cross-border team? So there is a layer in that. But we also saw that if you want to do interprofessional learning in an international context, it may not always be possible because the different professions have different roles and different educations in different countries. So in the Netherlands, we have mostly university level schooled nurses, and in some of these cross-border collaborations, physician assistants or specialized nurses involved. And in Germany, almost all the nurses are vocationally trained. So we discovered that nurses, that if we want to be interprofessional, if we want to do interprofessional training across the borders, we have to take into account that German nurses cannot actually talk at the same level with most of the Dutch nurses because of the differences in background. So there are limits to what you can do with interprofessional learning if the contexts that people come from really differ. That's for us a theoretical insight. Does that make any sense to you?
Yes, absolutely. I think it's as Richard says, it's frustrating to think that we have been doing this in snatches here and there, but we haven't recognized what it is we're doing.
Yeah.
And
yeah. So on a larger scale, we have the School of Health Professions Education in Maastricht has done a lot of research on problem-based learning, for example, as well. And we have published a lot on insights there. And what I was talking to somebody here, I can't remember, but for instance, in Maastricht, we started off thinking that the facilitator for PBL groups could be anybody. But then when research went on and design-based research went on, we discovered that the facilitator for PBL groups has to be somebody who has some understanding of the domain of the course. It doesn't have to be an expert in everything, but it can also not be anybody. That's another example.
Fascinating. That is really a good example. Richard, you have another question?
I just wanted to ask very quickly if or maybe a question or a comment, I'm not sure, but It strikes me that we need a sort of an SOP, a standard operating procedure, or a standard way in which we can incorporate design-based research into our training, into our daily activities, that just makes it easier, rather than each of us trying to do it separately, but rather have a common approach. I mean, I'm thinking of an umbrella ethics application would be helpful up front, because sometimes you want to be agile and responsive and then put something in place relatively quickly. Or am I missing it? Is that agility necessary, and that sort of standardization, would that help us, do you think, Danille? At all, if you're understanding my question?
Yeah, I think I have two thoughts about that. On the one hand, I think, yes, it would really help. On the other hand, my experience has also been that we cannot do design-based research on all the education that we design, because we simply don't have time. So it's good to think about how can we do it and standardize it in a way that we can do it more easily, but also good to think about where do we want to spend the effort to actually add a research component, because adding a research component does mean you have to be more thorough in how you, in the design process, mostly also in how you describe the design process, in the amount of literature research that you do beforehand, for example.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. There is that prep that then doesn't make it a quick job to implement. Okay.
Not for everything. Yeah.
Thank you.
So Danille, I just want to refer to a couple of questions in the chat. Lizelle asked, you're referring to design principles, and are there specific categories you should consider? Do you have something specific in mind when you talk about design principles overall?
Yeah, yes. Well, we use design principles as a stepping stone between learning theory and design. So in the examples here, I only presented the design principles, but behind those design principles, there are learning theories. So we tend to make it a two-step process. We look at learning theories that could be relevant based on who the target group is or what we're teaching. And then we derive important principles from those theories to help us design.
That does sound useful. Do you see that there's a question from Shanaz? I don't know, Shanaz, if there's anything you want to add. Carol's given a really comprehensive answer in the chat.
Afternoon, everyone. Thank you. I think I just wanted to know if it can be started kind of post, because I think Richard also alluded to the fact that a lot of the time we've already implemented courses, so we haven't done the whole process from the beginning. I really like that idea of the palliative care one, where the idea was put forward already. They knew there was resistance or assumptions made. So when the actual exercise was done, it did prove that some of those assumptions were not specifically or correct. So having started one of those programs already, I'm curious to see how we could use this process to improve and obviously change practices to get the best outcomes. Thank you.
Yeah, so I think it would be difficult to publish research on something that you have not asked for ethical permission beforehand. That's a very pragmatic one. But on the other hand, this design-based research is a cycle, and you can step in everywhere. Right, so if you have already implemented something and you have some data on how it was received or how it went, whether that's formal information or informal information, you can start a new cycle from there and say, okay, we have designed a new curriculum, master curriculum, or a new course 2 years ago. After 2 years, we have some information from student evaluations or talks at the coffee table about what is going well and what is not going well, so you can start your design-based research from there. Does that answer?
Yes, thank you. I think it was just how would we step in with an research having already started, but that helps a lot. Thank you.
So Shanaz, you guys are being privileged to have some one-on-one or one-on-departmental work with Danille later on in the week. So I look really forward to you grappling with this and being able to look at ways where you can enter the cycle. So I think that'll be useful. I see in the chat people are unsure about what the workshop tomorrow is going to be. Christina, I don't know if you can drop the advert in the chat. It was advertised across the faculty. There we are. Carol, you can send details to people if you're interested. We're across in the resource center in the School of Public Health, and Danielle's going to go more in depth in a workshop style rather than webinar style. So we'll all have a chance to actually work with the idea and get good feedback about how it actually works. So if anybody is interested, Carol's left her email address in the chat and you can get hold of her. And I do want to thank you. We have a 2-week engagement where there is going to be, I think, lots of opportunity for people to pursue this as an idea. Danielle's going to be very busy. She has individual engagements with certain departments. And aside from the workshop this Wednesday, she's giving a workshop for the University Capacity Development Grant next Wednesday. So there are lots of opportunities, I think, for us to engage with this idea and to learn lots more. Danille, thank you for not only coming here and giving us of your time, but your patience in discovering the ways that WITS does and does not work.
Well, no, I think that was actually my fault for sending the wrong presentation, so don't worry.
No, it's all
yeah,
good.
apologies for that.
No, it's all good. Thanks everybody for logging in this afternoon. We did have a really nice crowd coming to listen, and I hope you pursue this. This is the start of good things, I think. So I look forward, and next week we will also have an engagement with Danille. So please watch your emails for the advance notice. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Danille.
Thank you.